I've been wanting a Chudbox since I got into backyard barbecue a couple of years ago, but I don't have that kind of money knocking about. Then I figured, I can weld, kinda. Why not get a load of steel and see if I can knock one of these together, save a couple of grand in the process. Stick around, let's see if I can get this thing working. And that's exactly what I did. I went online and I ordered myself a bunch of steel, but only after watching Brad's video on how to build a Chudbox a couple of dozen times, and then spending about a week in SketchUp putting some ideas down, and this is what I came up with. It's pretty much the same as a Chudbox, the only differences really being the dimensions, the hinges and the handles, and the wooden shelf at the bottom over the expanded steel base that is on the Chudbox. I'm starting out by building the main body of the barbecue. I'm using 5mm or 13/64 inch, because that's easier, mild steel sheets. Just trying to get everything lined up nicely before I start welding it all out. I'm using some 7018 2.4mm electrodes. I think I'm running around 90 amps. Starting by tacking the corners in and then running full beads down the whole length of the joint just to make sure all the smoke and heat stays in while I'm cooking on this. Grinding these welds back to look pretty isn't the most important thing, as this is the inside of the barbecue and nobody's really ever going to see it after it's all put together. I'm just using some right angle magnets here to hold this base piece into place as I start welding it out. I was pretty surprised at how well just a couple of magnets will hold this heavy steel together. I'm just repeating the same process here for all the sides until I've basically welded together a big metal bucket. It was all pretty easy up until this part, but then we got to this final side, which was the bit I was really dreading the most.
This is the bit I'm not looking forward to. Getting in here to weld it.
So yeah, this was probably the least enjoyable part of this whole project, climbing inside this big metal box to try and weld it together. It was very cramped, it was hard to keep the electrode at the right angle and keep the travel speed right, so these welds are pretty messy inside here, but then I found it was easier just to sit outside and lean in, so I don't know why I didn't do that from the start really. I know that using 5mm thick steel might seem a bit overkill here, but I'm hoping this thing will last for years in my back garden, so I figured going overkill would be best in this situation. But saying that, when lifting it down from my welding table then I was slightly regretting my decision, because it's currently weighing around 55 kilos. That's around 40 Costco rotisserie chickens for my American friends. You're welcome. Moving on to the base of the barbecue, this is some 25mm 3mm wall steel box section. I'm just chopping a load of pieces down to size. It was pretty dirty coming from the store I bought it from, so I'm giving it a soak and a rub down with some white spirit just to clean all the dirt and grime off it before welding it out. This will just ensure a cleaner, stronger weld, and as it's got quite a lot of weight to hold, that's going to be full of fire as well. I don't really want this thing to fail. Once I'd got all the steel clean, I used my oscillating belt sander to start chamfering all the edges. This just gives the weld somewhere to sit when you put these pieces together and allows it to penetrate a little bit deeper into the metal. To weld out the frame, I've gone back to using some 6013 electrodes. As this steel box section is only 3mm and I've chamfered the edges, it doesn't need to penetrate as deep, and I just find these electrodes a little bit easier to run. So for the stand, I'm basically making two rectangles and then joining those two rectangles together, making sure everything stays as square as possible in the process. This final piece was a bit of a pain to get in, but a few whacks with the mallet set it into place. Then it was just a case of welding it out, grinding it down to make it look a bit nicer, and then attaching the frame to the main body of the barbecue. These welds again are pretty ugly, but they're on the bottom, you're not going to see them, it's fine. Welding this frame on adds another around 10 kilos to the total weight, so chuck another 7 chickens on for good measure. Now moving on to grinding down some 80mm flat bar. These are going to act as the wheel supports on the base, so I'm just notching the corner off so that that can sit in the space of the weld. You may have noticed the bottle of gas and the new welder under my welding table. I decided to upgrade from my arc welder to an Artec 180 amp MIG welder. I'm using a mix of 95% argon, 5% CO2, running at about 12 to 15 litres per minute. This is about 25 to 32 cubic feet per hour. Straight away I'm forgetting to attach the workpiece clamp to the barbecue, so I'm just firing wire out the end of the MIG gun. But as soon as I get that attached, this is just night and day compared to the arc welding. So much quicker, so much cleaner. It should really help speed along the process. Once I got all 4 corners in, I grind them back and get ready to attach these casters. These are able to hold around 100 kilos each, so that'll be plenty strong enough to hold the weight of the barbecue. Once I get all 4 corners welded on, I can roll the barbecue over and celebrate that I no longer have to pick this thing up. I can just roll it around. Next, I'm measuring the size to cut the internal supports. This is where the lid is going to rest when it's closed. So I'm just cutting down some 25mm angle steel, again 3mm thick, and we'll be welding these in place all around the perimeter of the barbecue. This should also provide a lot of structural support for the top of the barbecue to keep everything square. Once everything's welded in, moving it over to the grinder again just to clean up those welds, make everything look nice. I've got my super technical diagram all drawn out. I've got my grinder. Let's cut the fire door. This was quite a stressful process. I've marked out where the fire door is with this masking tape, and I'm just trying to cut as straight as I can along those lines through this steel. I'm intentionally not cutting right to the end of the lines, as I don't actually want the door to fall out. I'm going to weld it in place here with the banding just to make sure that everything stays aligned properly. Now I'm welding in the first piece of banding and the hinge I have made. I'll show you in a bit more detail later how I've made these hinges, but it's basically a couple of pieces of tube with a piece of round bar going through the middle to act as a pivot point. Continuing on to weld out all the steel banding to overlap the door. This is just to cover up the gap made by the grinding wheel and to ensure that the door only opens outwards, not inwards. And then realizing I might have made a small mistake.
I've got all the door banding done, but I've welded the door closed in the process, so I'm going to have to cut off this top piece of banding because this is the top corner that's stuck, recut the door, weld it back on, and hope that the door actually opens.
So yeah, I wasn't too impressed with myself after doing that, but it did work out for the best because I did realise that some of the banding that I'd put on wasn't quite square, so that did give me the opportunity to cut it all off and weld everything back on. So now you can see the door has opened successfully. Just grinding down all the sharp burrs off the inside of the door, both on the front of the barbecue and on the door itself. And then welding the round bar into the hinge just so it doesn't fall out and keeps the door in place. See, the door is now opening and the hinge is functioning as intended, so we can move on to starting to build out the lid. This is some 50mm by 30mm C-channel. I'm cutting mitered corners to weld effectively a frame that I can then attach to the top plate of the barbecue to form the lid. Once I've got everything welded out, I'm moving over to the oscillating belt sander again, just to clean up and round over all those edges. And then sitting in place on top of the barbecue. Starting by tacking the corners into place. I don't want to run long continuous beads here because that will just put way too much heat into the metal and cause it to warp. So I'm doing around 100 to 200 mil at a time, and then flipping the lid around, welding another area, and then coming back to finish it off. I'm spending a bit more time grinding down all these welds on the top of the lid, as they're right on the top of the barbecue. They're going to be what you see, or what I see the most when I'm using it, so I want them to look as good as possible. So back to the hinges. These are going to be the two hinges that hold the lid on the back. So you can see it's basically a piece of pipe cut in half, one half welded onto one piece of flat bar, the other half welded onto the other piece of flat bar, and the piece of round bar running through the middle that I'm welding onto one end only so it can pivot. And then I'm welding one piece of the flat bar onto the body of the barbecue, inserting the round bar into the other side of the hinge, and then welding the second piece of flat bar onto the lid of the barbecue. Trying to get those welds ground down as nice as I can, and then testing out, seeing that the hinges work, and adding a lid support so that the lid doesn't open all the way. The next job is to create the latch and locking mechanism for the Firebox door. So here I've got some 30mm flat bar that I've drilled a 10mm hole in. On the other end, I'm welding a bit more of the pipe that I use for the hinge to act as the handle. And then building out the latch mechanism. This is copying Brad's patented Chudbox design. Using some 80mm flat bar, I'm drilling some 10mm holes. Using the angle grinder to turn these into little notches that the handle I made previously can sit into. I'm drilling the same 10mm hole in the front of the fire door and bolting on the handle I've made, and then using this handle to line up with the latch. Just holding that in place with a couple of welding magnets until I can tack that into place. This will allow me to have the door open at different increments and to leave it open to control the airflow, which then in turn controls the temperature of the fire. And just add in a couple of tack welds just to help keep the latch mechanism in the right place. Before I move on to welding out the handles and installing them, I want to address the problem I've got here where the lid isn't sitting flush. So I've got a feeler gauge and I'm just feeling my way around. I've got it sorted all around this side, and I found a spot where it's sticking slightly in this back corner. So I'm going to grind that down a little bit and see if I can get that sitting nice and flush.
It's now sticking over this side, so I'm just going to grind a bit more of this side here.
After quite a lot more grinding, I was quite happy that the lid was sitting flush and the gap had closed up nicely, and that I wasn't going to get a load of smoke or heat escaping while I was cooking on this. But later on I did also add some gasket tape just to make doubly sure. And now I can move on to cutting down the metal for the handles. Again, I'm using the same 25mm steel box section with the 3mm walls and chamfering all the edges before welding them out. Now what you're seeing here is the last time I ever got to use my Triton oscillating belt sander. When they say don't use woodworking tools for working with metal, they kind of mean it. I think what happened was some metal dust got into the motor, so when I turned it on the next time, it blew the fuse and tripped all the electronics in my house, so that had to go down the dump. I'm now looking for a new, specifically metalworking tool to take its place. So if you want to know what I chose, why not hit the subscribe button and it might be in the next video. That's a really tempting offer, isn't it? Now I've got the handles welded out and obviously welded onto the barbecue there. Test that is working, and yep, it does what a handle does. Moving on to the two handles on the side, just welding them on in exactly the same way, and then moving around to the other side to put the other handle on, but you've already seen me weld two and you don't need to see the third. So now I'm measuring and cutting down some more angle iron, but this time 30mm, and this is going to be welded onto the inside of the barbecue to hold the grill rack in place. Getting the first rack support in was pretty easy, just using my right angle magnets again to hold it into place after making sure it's level. Then the tricky bit was getting the other rack support at the same height and level all the way across, just so that the grill rack can sit level in the barbecue. But once I got that all measured out, it was just a couple of small beads to hold it into place. It's not going to be holding a huge amount of weight, so that should be fine. And now welding out the frame for the grill rack. This is just again some 25mm angle iron. I 3D printed some 10mm spacer blocks, actually quite surprised they didn't melt more than they did, but I'm using them to separate this 6mm round bar to form my grill. Once I get that all welded out top and bottom, I can get the grill into the barbecue. And now moving on to the chimney stack. This is a piece of 75mm box section that I've welded a nut onto, and a piece of 80mm flat bar that I've welded a bolt onto. The flat bar is going to act as a damper on the chimney stack, and the bolt is just going to allow me to adjust that damper so I can control the airflow. To allow the chimney to work properly, I need to cut a hole into the lid of the barbecue, and again this was pretty terrifying experience because it's a lot of work if I mess this up, but thankfully it went alright. I lined up the chimney and I welded it into place, starting by tacking it in each corner and then running full beads all the way around. I was actually pretty happy with my welding here, so for a change I decided that I wasn't going to grind any of it back. I didn't quite like the proportions of the chimney to the body. I thought it was a bit too tall, so I did cut about 2.5 centimeters off the top of the chimney, which means I had to weld the bolt for the damper back onto the chimney, but all welded back into place, damper working as intended, and that's all the welding done. I've marked out a couple of holes on the front and I've just drilled those out so I can insert 2 thermometers. This will allow me to keep a closer eye on the temperature, meaning I can have a hot zone one side and a cooler zone the other side if I want. That just gives me a couple more options when I'm cooking on this. And that's the barbecue pretty much done. Now there's still quite a lot more video left, so obviously I'm going to do some more things, but yeah, in general terms the barbecue's done and ready to cook on. So I've lit a fire in it just to make sure that the welds don't pop and nothing opens up, and everything was fine. So I've started seasoning the inside of the barbecue just to make sure we don't get any rust. To do this I just gave it a coat of oil, sprayed it on, rubbed it in, let it heat up and repeated that process a few times. Now I said at the start of the video, one of the differences between my Chudbox and the Chudbox is the wooden shelf that I want to put on the bottom. So I've got a piece of oak here that was kindly given to me by my friend Lee, thank you Lee, and I'm going to use this for the shelf. I started milling this oak down by running one face and one side across my benchtop surface planer, and then moving over to my bandsaw where I'm ripping it down into individual boards. Once I've got the boards, I'm running them through my thickness planer to around 20mm thick. And once I've run all the boards through, I'm cleaning up the final side on my table saw. I'm using biscuits as the method to join these boards. I know it doesn't add strength, but it just lets me align the boards and keeps them flat, meaning I don't have to use any clamping cauls. I've always had success doing it this way, so I'm just going to carry on doing it like this. Using some basic Gorilla Glue, I've put a small amount of glue on each board and then knocking the biscuits into place, adding a bit more glue to them and setting down in the clamps for the glue up. making sure to wipe off as much of the glue squeeze out now, as it's a lot easier to clean up at this point than it is when it's dried. I've used some black CA glue to fill any knot holes or cracks in the wood. I could have gone with epoxy, but the CA glue just cures a hell of a lot quicker. I leave the glue to dry overnight, and then the next morning I come out and take off the clamps. I'm starting out with some 80 grit 3M Cubitron Extract 2 sandpaper, the same stuff I always use. Once I'm done with the 80 grit, I swap out for some 120 grit and go over both sides again. Just double checking the size I need to cut the shelf down. I want to make it slightly smaller just in case the wood wants to expand. As it's going to be outside, it's going to move with the seasons, so making it just a little bit smaller, that way it slots in nice and easily. Using my track saw to cut it down to the final size, and then finishing off by running it through the table saw. To finish off the shelf, I'm going around all edges with a 3mm round over bit. This is pretty much the same profile as the steel has, so it'll keep the look consistent. And then as always, just finishing off the roundovers with some hand sanding, just so I don't flatten out the profile. Using some white spirit to clean up any leftover dust from the sanding before applying the finish. While the white spirit's flashing off the oak shelf, I'm going to start giving the outside of the barbecue a clean with some white spirit too. That'll make it easier for the paint to stick. I did get a bit of oil on it when I was seasoning the inside the other day, so I just want to get that all nice and clean, and then we can start getting paint down. Should probably take the dials off and the handle off before I carry on. I'm going to be using this Osmo UV protection oil to finish the oak shelf. I've never used it before, but I've read online that some people have had good results applying it like a normal hard wax oil, just wipe on, wipe off. So I'm going to do that. It takes 12 hours between each coat. So I'll give it one coat now, front and back, leave it on for a while, wipe the excess off, and then come back tomorrow to do some more. Just using a maroon pad here just to lightly scuff the surface before applying the second coat of the Osmo. This technique always works well for me when applying finishes like Rubio, so I was hoping that it would transfer across to this, which it did quite well. Now, as you can see here, cleaning the barbecue with white spirit didn't really remove any of that polymerized oil, so I've busted out some acetone and I'm giving it another clean. And I'm quite happy to say that this did a much better job and just removed the oil straight away. The only downside was using this type of cloth. It left some fibres on the rough areas of the barbecue that were quite difficult to take off. We're jumping forward about a month now. My wife decided it would be a really good time to have our baby while I was working on this barbecue build, so unfortunately I had to take some time away from the build. But all jokes aside, everyone's doing fine. So I'm just setting up a paint booth in my garage as it's decided to rain outside, and I've got myself some paint that's able to withstand temperatures of up to 1000 degrees Celsius or around 1800 Fahrenheit. Not that we'll ever get this hot, but overkill seems to be the theme here, so I'm just running with it.
It's just like the paint isn't coming out. Very confused by what's going on here.
At this point I wasn't sure if there was a problem with the paint or if I was doing something wrong, but I carried on and well, you'll see what happens. So it looks like sitting the tins in hot water for 10 minutes before spraying actually worked. I have gone through 2 tins, I've got 1 left, so hopefully that's enough to finish doing the bottom and the back. So, out of paint. I think it's gone on all right now. I'll leave it a while to dry, we'll see how it goes, but I need to get out of it because it's very fumy. And I'm starting to get a little bit high. Well, that was a complete failure. That paint didn't go on how I was expecting it to. I put it on way too heavy and obviously it didn't stick. I've got another 3 tins on the way. I'm hoping I don't make the same mistake with them. Hopefully it will result in the barbecue being painted black rather than my garage floor having a load of powdery black paint all over it that I'm going to now have to hoover up. That's a waste of 30 quid. Never mind, we live and we learn. A few days later, the rest of the paint turned up, and I turned to our future AI overlords to find out how to properly apply a high heat paint, and I'm happy to say it went on a lot better. So I'm just finishing up the second coat here. I did put a third coat on just to get the colour really nice and deep, as you can see it is here, and to make sure that the barbecue would have as much protection against the elements as possible. So after leaving the paint to cure for a couple of days, I added back the thermometers and the latch mechanism, making sure everything's done up nice and tight so it won't fall off. Getting the grill back into place, and then I can start adding in the fire bricks that have been on my workbench for this whole video. These are designed to be used for building out pizza ovens so they can take a lot of heat. The idea of these bricks is just to reflect all the heat upwards, and it should offer some protection to the base of the barbecue. Yeah, it's 5mm thick steel, it shouldn't really need it, but remember, overkill. Adding these bricks adds another 30 kilos to the weight of the barbecue, which is now sitting around 150 kilos or 330-ish pounds. Again, very, very glad I put the casters on this. Once all the bricks are in and arranged how I want them, we can move on to the final bit of painting, and that is just for the base. I'm not using the high heat paint here, they shouldn't get too hot thanks to the fire bricks deflecting that heat upwards. So I've just grabbed the leftover can of hammerite paint that I used on my last video building the shoe rack just to finish it off. Now I did light a test fire in the barbecue just to heat cure the high heat paint, and it did start smoking a lot. So what I've got here is an old barbecue rack, it's some cast iron, and I'm just going to use that to elevate the coal bed off the base of the fire bricks. And after that we're almost done, so I can move the barbecue out of the garage and to its rightful place next to Chris Traeger in the back garden. So there's just one more thing that needs to be done before we fire up, and that is to get the shelf in. So it just sits in like this, and we are complete. So in total this build cost me about 600 quid. That's a saving of around 2 grand from actually buying a Chudbox, which was the kind of saving I was hoping for at the start of this video. Apart from buying the steel, the only other things I really bought were the thermometers, the fire bricks and the casters. I did try to fabricate as much as I could on this build, like the grill, the handles and the hinges, not just to keep the cost down, but to challenge myself and see if I could actually do it. And I'm really, really happy with how it came out. So with the first cook here, we're just going for some classic direct heat chicken with a mop sauce, just to get those direct heat barbecue flavours, and as you can see, it did not disappoint. So if you made it this far, thanks for sticking around and watching the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this kind of things. There'll be more coming soon. I'm gonna eat this chicken. Oh. Oh.